The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Highgrove House as Charles sat alone in his study, surrounded by towers of boxes that had arrived that morning. After Diana's passing, her personal belongings had been carefully stored away, but now, years later, her brother Earl Spencer had decided it was time for Charles to have access to her private journals and personal items. Charles picked up the first leather-bound diary with trembling hands. The cover was worn smooth from years of handling, and Diana's elegant handwriting graced the front page. My Private Thoughts, 1981. This was from their early married days, when the world still believed in their fairy tale romance. He opened to a random page, dated just 3 months after their wedding. Diana's words flowed across the page in her distinctive script. Charles came home late again today. I waited for him with dinner, but he never showed. I know he's busy with his duties, but sometimes I feel like I'm living with a ghost. The palace is so quiet, and I'm learning that being a princess isn't like the storybooks at all. Charles felt a knot form in his stomach. He remembered that day vividly. He had been attending a private meeting about agricultural reforms that had run hours longer than expected. He had assumed Diana would understand, as she always seemed to when he explained his absences later. Turning the page, he found an entry from their first Christmas together. Today, Charles gave me the most beautiful sapphire earrings. When I thanked him, he seemed genuinely surprised that I loved them so much. I wasn't sure what you'd like, he said quietly. How could he not know? I've been trying so hard to learn everything about him, his favorite tea, the way he likes, his newspapers folded, the classical music that makes him smile. But maybe he hasn't been watching me the same way. The words hit Charles like a physical blow. He had indeed been surprised by her reaction to the earrings. Camilla had helped him choose them, assuring him that any young woman would adore sapphires. But Diana's joy had seemed so genuine, so pure, that it had caught him off guard. He had begun to realize even then that his young wife was not like other people in his circle. Charles continued reading, finding entries about their early public appearances together. Diana wrote about her nervousness, her fear of making mistakes, and her desperate desire to make Charles proud. The photographers never stopped clicking, she had written after a charity event in Wales. Charles handles it all so naturally, like he was born for this life. I suppose he was, but I feel like I'm always one step behind, trying to catch up to a dance I was never taught. What struck Charles most was not just what Diana had written, but how she had written it. There was no bitterness in these early entries, no anger or resentment. Instead, there was hope, love, and a touching vulnerability that made his chest ache. She had been trying so hard to fit into his world, to become the wife she thought he needed. An entry from their trip to Australia caught his attention. Something wonderful happened today. During our walkabout in Melbourne, a little girl broke through the crowd and handed me a drawing she'd made of us. When I knelt down to thank her, Charles knelt beside me. For just a moment, we weren't the Prince and Princess of Wales. We were just two people sharing a sweet moment with a child. Charles smiled at me, really smiled, and I felt like maybe we could make this work. Charles remembered that day clearly. He had been struck by how naturally Diana connected with people, especially children. Her warmth wasn't calculated or performed for the cameras. It was genuine. He had felt a surge of pride watching her. And yes, he remembered that smile. It had been one of the few unguarded moments between them during those early years. But as he read further, Charles began to see the cracks forming in Diana's optimism. Entries from 1982 showed her growing loneliness and confusion. I tried to talk to Charles about having another baby after William is born, but he seemed distracted. We'll see, was all he said before changing the subject to his environmental project. I know his work is important, but sometimes I wonder if there's room in his life for a real family, not just the idea of one. The irony wasn't lost on Charles. He had desperately wanted children, but he had also been terrified of fatherhood. His own childhood had been so formal, so distant, that he worried about repeating those patterns. Diana's eagerness for family. Life had both thrilled and intimidated him. Near the end of the 1981 diary, Diana had written something that made Charles pause entirely. "I found a book of poetry in Charles's study today, Wordsworth. The pages were well worn, and there were notes in the margins in his handwriting. His thoughts about nature and solitude were so beautiful, so deep. I never knew he had such a romantic soul hidden under all that formality. I wish he would share that side of himself with me. I wish I knew how to reach it." Charles set the diary down and walked to his bookshelf, pulling out that same volume of Wordsworth. The pages were indeed well worn, filled with his younger self's marginalia. Diana had seen something in those notes that even he had forgotten was there. A part of himself he had buried under duty and expectation. As the evening grew darker, Charles realized that these diaries were going to change everything he thought. He knew about his marriage to Diana. She had been watching him, trying to understand him, loving him in ways he had been too blind or too afraid to see. The young woman who had seemed so different from him had actually been trying desperately to bridge the gap between their worlds. He looked at the stack of remaining diaries, years of Diana's private thoughts still waiting to be discovered. Part of him wanted to stop reading, to preserve the version of their story he had carried for so long. But Diana's words had already begun to work their way into his heart, showing him glimpses of a love story he had never fully understood while he was living it. The first diary had revealed Diana's hope and determination. Charles could only imagine what revelations the others would bring, and whether he was strong enough to face the truth about what they had both lost along the way. The next morning, Charles woke earlier than usual, drawn back to Diana's diaries like a man discovering water after years in a desert. He picked up the 1983 diary, knowing it would contain entries about Harry's birth and what should have been some of their happiest moments together. The first entry of the year revealed Diana's excitement about her second pregnancy, but also her growing awareness of the distance between them. "I told Charles about the baby yesterday. He smiled and said all the right things, but there was something missing in his eyes. The spark that was there when I told him about William seems dimmed now. I wonder if he's already thinking about the responsibilities rather than the joy." Charles remembered that conversation differently. He had been thrilled about Harry, but he had also been dealing with mounting pressure from his father about his royal duties and growing criticism from the press about his marriage. Diana's pregnancy announcement had come during a particularly difficult week, and he realized now that his preoccupation with external pressures had stolen his ability to be fully present for that precious moment. As he read further, Charles discovered Diana's growing isolation within the palace walls. An entry from February 1983 read, "The staff are always polite, but I can see in their eyes that they're comparing me to how things used to be." Charles has his routines, his trusted people, his way of doing everything. "I feel like I'm disrupting a perfectly ordered world just by existing in it. Even asking for a cup of tea feels like I'm causing trouble." The entry continued with devastating honesty. "I tried to redecorate our sitting room today. I thought some warmer colors and softer furniture might make it feel more like a home." Charles came in and stopped short, like he didn't recognize his own space. "It's very colorful," he said carefully. I could tell he hated it, but he was trying to be kind. "I had the staff change everything back the next day." Charles closed his eyes, remembering that sitting room incident. He hadn't hated Diana's changes. They had actually been quite beautiful. But they had been so different from everything he was used to that they had felt foreign to him. Instead of seeing them as Diana's attempt to create a shared space, he had seen them as an intrusion into his established life. how blind he had been to her efforts to build a home rather than just maintain a residence. Diana's pregnancy entries revealed her physical discomfort but also her emotional struggles. The morning sickness is terrible again, but that's not the worst part. The worst part is facing it alone. Charles leaves early for his meetings and comes home after I've gone to bed. I know he's busy, but I'm carrying his child and I feel invisible. The baby kicks strongest at night, as if he knows his father isn't there to feel him moving. Charles felt his throat tighten. He had been avoiding Diana during her difficult pregnancy, not out of lack of care, but out of helplessness. He hadn't known how to comfort her when she was sick, hadn't understood that his presence might matter more than his ability to fix anything. He had retreated into work, thinking he was giving her space to rest, never realizing he was giving her loneliness instead. The diary entries around Harry's birth in September 1983 were particularly painful to read. Harry arrived this morning after a long, difficult night. Charles was there for the birth, and when the doctor placed our son in his arms, I saw tears in his eyes. For a moment, I thought things might change between us, but within hours, he was fielding phone calls about official duties, already planning his schedule around visits to see the baby. I'm lying here holding our son, feeling like I've just lived through the most important moment of my life, and Charles is discussing agricultural policies with his private secretary. What Diana couldn't have known was that Charles had been fighting his own emotional turmoil. Holding Harry for the first time had overwhelmed him with love and terror in equal measure. He had thrown himself into work immediately afterward, not because the baby didn't matter, but because the intensity of his feelings had frightened him. He had never been taught how to express such emotions, and work had been his only escape from feelings too big to handle. An entry from October 1983 showed Diana beginning to understand the fundamental problem in their marriage. I realize now that Charles and I speak different languages, even when we're using the same words. When I say, "I need you," he hears criticism of his priorities. When he says, "I have obligations," I hear, "You're not important enough." We're both trying to love each other, but somehow we keep missing the mark. Charles was amazed by Diana's insight. Even in her pain, she had been trying to understand him, trying to find ways to bridge their communication gap. She had seen what he couldn't see himself, that they were both struggling with love, just in different ways. The diary revealed Diana's attempts to interest herself in Charles's passions. I've been reading about organic farming and architecture, trying to understand the things that light up Charles's face when he talks about them. I asked him about sustainable agriculture yesterday, and he spent an hour explaining crop rotation to me. His whole demeanor changed. He became animated, passionate, alive in a way I rarely see. I didn't understand half of what he said, but I loved watching him care so deeply about something. Charles remembered that conversation. Diana's questions had seemed genuine, and he had been excited to share his environmental concerns with her. But he had also worried that he was boring her with technical details, so he had cut the conversation short. He never knew she had been studying his interests, trying to find common ground between their very different worlds. As winter approached in the diary entries, Diana's loneliness deepened. Charles brought me roses today. Beautiful, expensive roses from the palace gardens. When I thanked him, he seemed pleased but also surprised, as if he hadn't expected me to appreciate them. They're lovely, but what I really wanted was for him to pick a single wildflower during one of his walks and bring it to me because it reminded him of something we shared. The roses feel like an obligation fulfilled rather than a gift freely given. The entry continued. I think Charles believes that doing the correct thing is the same as doing the loving thing. He opens doors for me, remembers important dates, ensures I have everything I need materially. But I can't shake the feeling that he would do all these same things for any woman in my position. I want to matter to him not because I'm his wife, but because I'm me. Charles set down the diary and walked to the window, looking out at the same gardens where those roses had been cut decades ago. Diana had been right. The roses had been obligation, not inspiration. He had seen her sadness and asked the gardener to prepare something beautiful, thinking that was how to solve the problem. He hadn't understood that what she needed wasn't expensive flowers, but evidence that he thought about her when they were apart. The final entries of 1983 showed Diana beginning to build walls around her heart. I'm learning to expect less from Charles, and perhaps that's healthier for both of us. When I don't look for him to understand my jokes, I'm not disappointed by his polite smile. When I don't hope for spontaneous affection, I can appreciate the scheduled kindnesses he provides. Maybe this is how royal marriages work. Two people, living parallel lives with occasional moments of intersection. But even as Diana wrote about lowering her expectations, Charles could see her love persisting. Despite everything, when Charles laughs at something, really laughs, not that careful public chuckle, my heart still skips. When he's playing with the boys and forgets to be formal, I see glimpses of the man I fell in love with. I think that man is still in there, buried under duty and tradition. I just don't know how to reach him anymore. Reading these entries, Charles realized that 1983 had been a turning point in their marriage, the year when Diana stopped believing. Their love story could have a fairy tale ending and started trying to survive in a relationship that felt more like a beautiful prison than a home. Charles approached the 1985 diary with heavy heart, knowing this period marked some of the most difficult times in their marriage. The public had begun to notice the strain between them, though they had both worked hard to maintain appearances during official engagements. The first entry that caught his attention was from Valentine's Day. Charles gave me a beautiful pearl necklace today. The card said, "With affection, Charles." With affection, not with love, not with devotion, but with affection, as if I were a distant relative he was fond of. I wore it to dinner and tried to smile, but all I could think was how carefully he had chosen that word. Even his expressions of feeling are measured and safe. Charles remembered selecting that card with painstaking care, reading dozens of options before settling on something that felt appropriate. He had thought, with affection, struck the right tone, warm but not overly emotional. Reading Diana's reaction now, he realized she had needed to hear love, needed to know that his feelings for her went deeper than polite fondness. The diary entries revealed Diana's growing understanding of Charles's relationship with Camilla, though she never mentioned her by name in these early references. There's someone else who understands Charles in ways I never will. I can see it in how he changes when certain phone calls come through, how his voice softens when he thinks I'm not listening. I'm not stupid, though everyone seems to think I should pretend to be. There's a history there, a connection that existed long before me and apparently continues to exist despite me. What struck Charles most was Diana's pain was mixed with a kind of bewildered respect. I almost envy her, whoever she is. She knows exactly what to say to make Charles laugh, knows his moods and his needs without having to guess. I've been trying so hard to become the woman Charles wants. But maybe the woman Charles wants isn't me at all. Maybe it never was. The diary showed Diana beginning to find her own identity, separate from her role as Charles's wife. I went to that homeless shelter again today, the one the palace initially said was too controversial. But when I sat with those young people and heard their stories, I felt more useful than I have in months. One girl, barely 18, told me I was the first person in authority who had ever looked her in the eye when she spoke. How sad is that? But also, how wonderful that I could be that person for her. Charles remembered discouraging Diana from visiting that particular shelter, worried about the political implications. But reading her words now, he could see how that work had fed her soul in ways that state dinners and ribbon cuttings never could. She had found her purpose in the places he had considered too risky. An entry from June 1985 revealed Diana's growing frustration with royal protocol. Today I was told that my dress was inappropriate for the garden party because it was too approachable. Apparently, I smiled too much and touched people too often during the walkabout. The private secretary explained that royalty should be warm but distant, accessible but not common. I wanted to scream that these aren't contradictions. They're impossibilities. How can you be genuine when every gesture is calculated? The entry continued. Charles seems to navigate these rules effortlessly, as if he was born knowing exactly how to be royal without being human. Maybe he was. But I feel like I'm constantly failing at being something I never wanted to be in the first place. The saddest part is that Charles sees my struggles as weaknesses rather than as signs that I'm trying to stay true to who I am. Charles paused at these words, realizing he had indeed interpreted Diana's difficulties with protocol as character flaws rather than as evidence of her authenticity. He had been trained from birth to suppress his natural reactions, to present a carefully controlled version of himself to the public. Diana's spontaneous warmth had seemed dangerous to him because it was uncontrolled, but reading her words now he could see it had been her greatest strength. The summer entries of 1985 showed Diana grappling with the loneliness of their separate lives. Charles left for Scotland today without me. He said it would be better if I stayed in London with the boys, that Balmoral isn't really my sort of place. He's probably right. I don't understand the appeal of shooting things or spending hours in silence looking at landscapes. But I would have tried to understand if he had wanted me there. The fact that he doesn't even want me to try says everything. Charles winced at this entry. He had indeed found excuses to leave Diana behind during his Scottish retreats, telling himself it was kindness because she seemed uncomfortable there. But Diana's words revealed the truth. She would have endured the discomfort if it meant spending time with him. His attempts to spare her had actually been attempts to spare himself from the awkwardness of their differences. An autumn entry showed Diana beginning to find strength in her isolation. I've stopped waiting for Charles to invite me into his world. Instead, I'm building my own world, and it's more colorful and more real than anything I've experienced in this marriage. The people I meet through my charity work don't care that I don't understand agricultural policy or Renaissance architecture. They care that I listen, that I remember their names, that I see them as human beings worthy of attention. But even as Diana wrote about her growing independence, her love for Charles persisted. Sometimes I catch Charles watching me when he thinks I'm not looking, and there's something almost wistful in his expression. I wonder what he's thinking in those moments. Does he ever wonder what our marriage might have been like if we had met as ordinary people? Does he ever wish he could love me without worrying about duty and tradition and public expectations? The most revealing entry came in November 1985. Charles and I had our first real fight today. Not the careful disagreements we usually have, but an actual fight with raised voices and real emotions. It started over something silly. I wanted to change William's bedtime routine, but it became about everything else. Charles accused me of being too emotional, too unpredictable. I accused him of being too rigid, too afraid of feeling anything real. We both said things we can't take back. The entry continued. But here's the strange thing. For the first time in years, I felt like Charles was actually seeing me. Even angry, even hurt. He was present in a way he hasn't been since our wedding day. I almost preferred his anger to his polite indifference. At least anger means I matter enough to upset him. Charles remembered that fight with crystal clarity. Diana had been right about everything she'd accused him of. He was afraid of real emotion, afraid of disrupting the careful control he maintained over every aspect of his life. Her passion had terrified him because it reminded him of everything he had buried in himself. The final entries of 1985 showed Diana beginning to accept the reality of their situation. I think Charles and I love each other in theory, but not in practice. We love the idea of being happy together, but we don't know how to actually be happy together. Maybe that's enough for a royal marriage. Maybe I need to stop expecting fairy tales and start accepting reality. Yet even this acceptance was tinged with hope. But sometimes, when Charles is reading to the boys, or when he's explaining some historical fact with genuine enthusiasm, I see flashes of the man he could be if he weren't so afraid of disappointing everyone. I haven't given up on that man completely. I probably never will. Reading these entries from 1985, Charles could see that this was the year Diana had begun to grow beyond him, to become the person she was meant to be despite the constraints of their marriage. And perhaps most painfully, he could see that she had continued to love him even as she learned to stop depending on him for her happiness. Diana's Secret Diary. Part 4, the 1987 diary, felt different in Charles's hands, heavier somehow, as if it contained the weight of accumulated disappointments and hard-won wisdom. By now, Diana had been a royal for 6 years, and her handwriting showed a new maturity, though her honesty remained as piercing as ever. The year opened with an entry that took Charles's breath away. I dreamed about Charles last night. Not the Charles I'm married to, but the Charles I sometimes glimpse in unguarded moments. In the dream, we were just two people walking through a garden, talking about everything and nothing. He was laughing at something I'd said, really laughing, and I wasn't performing or trying to be anyone other than myself. When I woke up, I realized I was mourning a marriage that never actually existed except in my imagination. Charles set the diary down for a moment, staring out at his own garden. How many times had he dreamed similar dreams, of a life where duty didn't dictate? Every conversation, where he could love Diana without the weight of expectations crushing every spontaneous moment between them. Diana's entries showed her increasingly focusing on her humanitarian work, finding purpose outside the confines of traditional royal duties. Visited the AIDS ward again today. The staff initially seemed nervous about having me there. Apparently, some advisors had suggested it was too controversial, but when I held hands with a young man who was dying, far from his family, I knew this was exactly where I needed to be. His eyes lit up when I sat beside his bed, and we talked about his dreams before he got sick. When I left, one of the nurses said I was the first royal to touch an AIDS patient without gloves. I hadn't even thought about it. He was just another human being who needed to feel less alone. Charles remembered the controversy surrounding Diana's AIDS work. His advisors had indeed cautioned against it, worried about public perception and political implications. But reading Diana's words now, he could see that her instinctive compassion had been exactly what the world needed. While he had been calculating risks, she had been saving lives simply by showing up authentically. An entry from spring 1987 revealed Diana's growing awareness of her public impact. The strangest thing happened during the walkabout in Birmingham. A woman broke down crying when she shook my hand, saying she had lost her son in a car accident and hadn't been able to cry until that moment. I wasn't doing anything special, just listening, just being present. But somehow that was enough. It made me wonder if this is what I'm really meant to do with this position. Not cut ribbons and make small talk, but help people feel less invisible. What moved Charles most was how Diana had begun to see her sensitivity, the quality he had often viewed as a liability, as her greatest asset. Charles sometimes seems embarrassed by how emotional I get with people, how easily I cry when I hear their stories. But today I realized that my tears give other people permission to feel their own pain fully. When I cried with that mother who lost her child, she wasn't alone in her grief anymore. Maybe being too emotional isn't a weakness after all. The diary also revealed Diana's growing understanding of the impossible position Charles occupied. I watched Charles during that trade dinner last night, saw how he navigated conversations where every word could be interpreted as political commentary. He was charming but careful, knowledgeable but non-committal, interested but detached. It must be exhausting to live with such constant self-censorship. I'm beginning to understand that Charles's reserve isn't necessarily coldness. It might be survival. This insight was followed by a painful recognition. But understanding Charles doesn't make living with him any easier. I can sympathize with his constraints while still feeling starved for authentic connection. I can appreciate his dedication to duty while still longing for a husband who occasionally chooses me over obligation. Compassion doesn't cure loneliness. Summer entries showed Diana wrestling with the growing media attention and public speculation about their marriage. The newspapers are starting to notice what we've hidden for years, that Charles and I are more like polite colleagues than passionate spouses. Today's headline called us the unhappy couple, and while it hurt to see our private pain made public, I couldn't deny the accuracy. We've become expert at performing marriage without actually living it. Yet Diana also wrote about moments of genuine connection that still occasionally broke through their careful distance. Something wonderful happened yesterday. William fell and scraped his knee badly, and both Charles and I rushed to comfort him. For those few minutes, we weren't the Prince and Princess of Wales. We were just two parents focused entirely on our hurt child. Charles held William while I cleaned the wound, and our hands touched as we both reached to stroke his hair. It was the most natural, unguarded moment we've shared in months. I found myself wishing we could have more emergencies if that's what it takes to remember we're on the same team. The autumn entries revealed Diana's growing strength and independence. I've stopped asking Charles to understand my work or my choices. Instead, I'm simply doing what feels right and letting him react however he needs to. Today I announced my patronage of that drug rehabilitation center, despite knowing it would worry his advisors. But I've seen too many young people destroyed by addiction to let political concerns override human need. Charles was politely supportive in public, which is probably the best I can hope for. An entry from October showed Diana beginning to find peace with their limitations. I think I've been trying to force Charles to be someone he's not, the same way he's been trying to shape me into someone I can never be. We fell in love with potential rather than reality, and we've been punishing each other for not living up to impossible expectations ever since. Maybe acceptance is the first step toward finding whatever kind of love is actually possible between us. But the most revealing entry came in November, after a state dinner where Diana had particularly shone. Charles complimented me tonight on how well I handled the German ambassador's wife. He said I had been perfectly appropriate, his highest form of praise. But as he said it, I saw something like sadness in his eyes, as if he knew that perfectly appropriate was a poor substitute for beautiful or brilliant, or any of the words a husband might use to describe a wife he was truly proud of. I think Charles does love me, but he loves me the way one loves a painting that matches the furniture, with appreciation for how well it fits rather than for what it means. The year ended with an entry that showed Diana's growing clarity about their future. I no longer believe Charles and I will ever have the marriage I dreamed of when I said yes to his proposal. But maybe we can have something else. A partnership built on respect rather than passion, on shared purpose rather than romantic love. It's not the fairy tale I wanted, but it might be enough to build a meaningful life on. The question is whether either of us can find the courage to stop mourning what we never had and start appreciating what we actually have. Reading these entries from 1987, Charles could see Diana transforming from the heartbroken young woman of earlier diaries into someone stronger, wiser, and more self-aware. She had found her own path to happiness, even within the constraints of their difficult marriage. And perhaps most remarkably, she had managed to do so without losing her essential kindness or her capacity to love, qualities that Charles was beginning to realize he had never fully valued while he still had the chance to cherish them properly. Diana's Secret Diary, Part 5. The 1992 diary arrived with a reputation that preceded it. Charles knew this was the year their marriage would finally, publicly, fall apart. But he was unprepared for the depth of reflection and surprising moments, of grace he would find in Diana's words during their darkest period. The year began with an entry that revealed Diana's internal preparation for what was coming. I woke up this morning knowing that this year will change everything. I can feel it in the way Charles avoids my eyes, in how carefully the staff speak around both of us, in the way even the boys seem to sense the tension between their parents. We've been pretending for so long that I think we've forgotten what authenticity feels like, but pretense has an expiration date, and ours is approaching fast. By now, Diana's charity work had become her primary source of fulfillment. Spent the day at the children's hospital. A little girl named Emma, maybe 7 years old, asked me why I looked sad. I told her I was just tired, but she said, "No. You look the way my mummy looks when she thinks no one is watching." Children see everything, don't they? They haven't learned yet that adults lie about their feelings to protect each other. Maybe Emma was right to call me out. Maybe I have been carrying sadness like a weight, and it's heavier than I thought. An entry from March showed Diana grappling with the public's fascination with their private struggles. The newspapers are having a field day with our marriage troubles. Every gesture between Charles and me gets analyzed. Every public appearance becomes evidence for one theory or another about our relationship. It's surreal to read strangers' opinions about my own life, and sometimes find them more accurate than my own self-deception. Today's article called us two good people trapped in an impossible situation, and I found myself grateful for that small kindness. What struck Charles most was Diana's continued empathy for his position, even as their marriage crumbled. I watched Charles during that agricultural conference yesterday, saw how passionate he became when discussing sustainable farming. His whole face changed. He looked younger, more alive than I've seen him in years. It reminded me that Charles isn't just the man who can't love me properly. He's also a man with deep convictions and genuine hopes for making the world better. Our marriage may be failing, but that doesn't make him a failure as a person. The diary revealed Diana's growing confidence in her own judgment. The palace advisors suggested I scale back my AIDS work because of the upcoming separation announcements. They're worried about maintaining dignity during difficult times, but I told them that my work with AIDS patients is exactly what gives me dignity. Taking care of people who need it isn't a distraction from my royal duties. It is my royal duty, at least the way I understand it. Summer entries showed Diana processing the reality of their public separation. Charles and I had our most honest conversation in years today. Not about trying to fix things, but about how to end them with as much grace as possible. He was kinder than he's been in ages, almost gentle, as if acknowledging our failure had freed him to be more human with me. We talked about the boys, about maintaining stability for them despite the chaos we've created. For the first time in years, we felt like partners again, not romantic partners, but two people working together toward a common goal. The entry continued with surprising tenderness. Charles asked me if I regretted marrying him, and I surprised myself by saying no. Not because our marriage was successful, but because it taught me who I am when stripped of illusions. I learned I'm stronger than I thought, more resilient, more capable of loving even when that love isn't returned the way I hoped. Charles looked relieved when I said this, and I realized he'd been carrying guilt about ruining my life. I told him we ruined it together, but we also built something together. 2 beautiful sons and a better understanding of ourselves. An entry from August revealed Diana's thoughts about their public announcement. The separation statement will be released next week. Charles and I reviewed the wording together, trying to find language that was honest but not destructive, final but not bitter. The Prince and Princess of Wales have decided to separate amicably. Such careful words to describe the end of a fairy tale. But maybe that's appropriate. Our beginning was all romance and drama. Perhaps our ending should be quiet and dignified. Diana also wrote about the unexpected relief she felt. There's something liberating about no longer having to pretend our marriage is working. The constant performance was exhausting. Smiling when photographers were watching, standing the appropriate distance apart, coordinating our public schedules to suggest unity while living completely separate private lives. Now I can focus on being the best mother I can be and the most effective advocate for the causes I care about, without worrying about how it reflects on a marriage that exists only in headlines. The autumn entries showed Diana dealing with the aftermath of their separation announcement. The public reaction has been overwhelming. Thousands of letters from people sharing their own divorce stories, offering support, expressing disappointment. What strikes me most is how many people saw our marriage as somehow belonging to them, as if our love story was public property. I suppose in a way it was. When you live your life in the spotlight, everything becomes a symbol of something larger than yourself. But Diana also wrote about unexpected sources of support. Charles sent me flowers yesterday, not for any special occasion, just a note saying he hoped I was handling the media attention well. It was such a thoughtful gesture, the kind of thing I always hoped he would do spontaneously during our marriage. Ironic that he's become more considerate now that we're separated than he ever was when we were trying to be together. A particularly poignant entry from October revealed Diana's reflections on love and compatibility. I've been thinking about whether Charles and I ever really loved each other or just loved the idea of each other. I think the truth is both. I loved his intelligence, his dedication, his hidden sensitivity. He loved my warmth, my spontaneity, my ability to connect with people. But we never learned to love each other's flaws or to accept our fundamental differences. I needed emotional availability. He needed space. He needed predictability. I needed adventure. Neither of us was wrong, but we were wrong for each other. The diary also showed Diana's growing understanding of the institutional pressures that had shaped their relationship. I'm beginning to see that Charles and I were both victims of expectations that were impossible to fulfill. He was supposed to marry appropriately and produce heirs while maintaining his dignity and serving his country. I was supposed to transform instantly from a young woman into a perfect princess, while providing him with unconditional support and asking for nothing in return. No two people could have succeeded under those conditions, especially not two people, as different as we were. November entries revealed Diana's hopes for the future. I want to show William and Harry that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit when something isn't working and choose to change course. I don't want them to think of their parents as failures, but as people who tried their best and then had the courage to try something different when their best wasn't enough. Maybe our separation will teach them that love isn't always about staying together. Sometimes it's about letting go with grace. The year ended with an entry that would stay with Charles forever. I saw Charles at Harry's school play today. We sat together like any divorced parents trying to maintain normalcy for their children. During intermission, he asked me how I was really doing, not the polite question he asks in public, but a genuine inquiry about my well-being. When I said I was learning to be happy in ways I never expected, he smiled, really smiled, and said he was glad. In that moment, I realized that Charles and I might actually become friends now that we're no longer trying to be lovers. Maybe that's our real love story. Not the romance that failed, but the respect that survived its failure. As Charles closed the 1992 diary, he felt something he hadn't expected: gratitude. Diana's words had shown him that their separation, while painful, had also been an act of mutual kindness. They had freed each other to become who they were meant to be, rather than continuing to struggle against their incompatibilities. Her grace during their darkest period had been a gift he was only now learning to appreciate. Diana's Secret Diary, Part 6. The final diary Charles picked up was from 1995, just 2 years before Diana's death. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, knowing these would be among the last private thoughts she ever recorded, written during a period when she had found her voice and her purpose, despite the wreckage of their marriage. The first entry took his breath away with its clarity and forgiveness. I had coffee with Charles today to discuss the boys' summer plans. It was strange how easy it was to talk to him now that we're not trying to be married. He seemed more relaxed, more like the man I glimpsed occasionally during our early courtship. We even laughed together about William's latest rebellious phase. I found myself thinking that if we had met as friends first, instead of as a prince seeking a suitable bride and a young woman overwhelmed by a fairy tale, we might have actually liked each other. Diana's entries from this period showed a woman who had fully come into her own. The landmines campaign is gaining momentum in ways I never expected. When I first suggested walking through those minefields in Angola, everyone thought I had lost my mind. But sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is literally walk where others fear to go. The images of me in that protective gear, surrounded by cleared land that children can now play on safely, seem to be worth more than 1,000 speeches about humanitarian concerns. Charles remembered his own reaction to Diana's landmine work, a mixture of admiration and terror. He had worried constantly about her safety, but he had also been amazed by her courage and the global attention she brought to an issue that politicians had ignored for years. An entry from spring 1995 revealed Diana's thoughts about their divorce. Proceedings. The lawyers are working out the final details of our divorce. It's surreal to have my marriage reduced to legal documents and financial arrangements. But there's also relief in making official what has been reality for years. Charles and I stopped being husband and wife long before we stopped being married. Now the paperwork will finally match the truth. Yet even during this legal dissolution, Diana wrote about moments of unexpected connection. Charles called yesterday to ask my opinion about a speech he's writing on environmental conservation. It was the first time in years he had sought my input on something important to him. I was touched that he valued my perspective, even though our marriage is ending. We talked for nearly an hour about how to make complex issues accessible to ordinary people. It reminded me that we do share some fundamental values, even if we could never share a life. The diary showed Diana's growing confidence in her public role. I'm learning that I don't need official titles or institutional approval to make a difference. When I hugged that AIDS patient on television, when I sat with homeless teenagers, when I walked through those minefields, I wasn't acting as the Princess of Wales. I was acting as Diana, and somehow that was enough. Maybe more than enough. Maybe being authentic has more power than being royal. Summer entries revealed Diana's reflections on motherhood and her hopes for William and Harry. The boys are growing up to be such different people from what either Charles or I expected. William has his father's sense of duty, but my emotional openness. Harry has my mischievous spirit, but Charles's underlying kindness. They're taking the best from both of us while avoiding our worst patterns. Maybe that's what successful parenting looks like. Not creating perfect children, but raising kids who are better than their parents' mistakes. An entry from July showed Diana's growing peace with her past. I was cleaning out some old boxes today and found the ring Charles gave me when he proposed. I held it for a long time, remembering how enormous it looked on my 19-year-old hand, how I thought it was the key to a perfect life. That girl believed in fairy tales. This woman knows that real life is more complicated and more beautiful than any fairy tale could be. I don't regret believing in magic, and I don't regret learning to live without it. Diana also wrote about her relationship with the media and public attention. The photographers follow me everywhere now, more than they ever did when Charles and I were together. It's as if my independence makes me more interesting than my marriage ever did. Sometimes it's exhausting, but I'm learning to use the attention strategically. If they're going to photograph me anyway, I might as well make sure I'm somewhere that matters, holding hands with sick children, highlighting forgotten causes, showing the world that royalty can be about service rather than ceremony. and autumn. Entry revealed Diana's thoughts about love and relationships. People ask me if I'm ready to fall in love again, if I want to remarry. I tell them I'm already in love, with my children, with my work, with the person I've become through all this struggle. Romantic love is beautiful, but it's not the only kind that matters. I spent so many years thinking Charles's love was necessary for my happiness that I forgot to love myself. Now that I've remembered how, everything else feels like a bonus rather than a necessity. The final entry Charles read was dated just months before Diana's death. I've been thinking about legacy lately. Not the official kind that gets carved on monuments, but the real kind that lives in how people remember you touch their lives. I hope people remember that I tried to use whatever influence I had to make others feel less alone. I hope William and Harry remember that their mother fought for what she believed in, even when it was difficult. And I hope Charles remembers that I loved him the best way I knew how, even if it wasn't the way he needed to be loved. The entry continued with words that would haunt Charles forever. I also hope Charles knows that I never regretted the journey we took together, even though it didn't end where we expected. Our love story wasn't the fairy tale the world wanted, but it was real. Real love, real pain, real growth, real forgiveness. Maybe that's more valuable than a perfect ending. Maybe the mess and the beauty of real human connection is what makes a story worth telling. As Charles closed the final diary, he sat in silence for a long time. Diana's words had taken him on a journey through their entire relationship, showing him a woman he had lived with for years, but never fully understood. She had been braver than he realized, wiser than he had given her credit for, and more forgiving than he had any right to expect. The diaries had revealed not just Diana's growth, but his own failures and fears. He had been so afraid of vulnerability that he had missed countless opportunities to connect with the remarkable woman who had shared his life. But perhaps most importantly, Diana's words had shown him that love could survive the failure of a marriage, that respect could emerge from disappointment, and that understanding could bloom even after it was too late to change anything. Charles carefully placed the last diary back in its box, knowing that Diana's words had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. She had given him one final gift, the chance to see their story through her eyes, and in doing so to find forgiveness for both of them. The fairy tale had ended, but the love story, as Diana had written, was real. And real, Charles now understood, was infinitely more precious than perfect.